Havenford is located in a valley between the forested hills of eastern Kentucky, as if protected from the storms of the outside world by natural barriers. The main street stretches for only 8 blocks, lined with neatly arranged Victorian houses with porches, local shops, and several small businesses. Everyone knows everyone here, and doors are rarely locked. In the heart of the town stands Grace Church, a white stone building with a tall spire, built in 1887 by the local residents themselves. Stained glass windows cast colorful reflections on the polished oak pews, and a massive organ, donated to the church in the 1920s, still fills the sanctuary with solemn melodies every Sunday. Pastor Klaus Miller arrived in Havenford 8 years ago with his young wife, Chloe. The 40-year-old man of German descent, with piercing gray eyes and a neatly trimmed beard, quickly won the respect of his parishioners with his thoughtful sermons and sincere concern for his flock. His theological education, received at Louisville Seminary, was combined with a practical understanding of the needs of a small community. Klaus was not one of those pastors who limited himself to Sunday services. He regularly visited sick parishioners, participated in school events, and organized programs to help families in need. His office at the church was always open to those seeking spiritual counsel or simply in need of conversation. The walls of his office were decorated with diplomas, photographs of church events, and shelves of theological literature, which he studied late into the night. At 35, Chloe Muller was the embodiment of the ideal pastor's wife. A slender woman with chestnut hair, which she always styled neatly in an elegant bun, she possessed natural charm and organizational skills. She did not work outside the home, devoting herself to church affairs and supporting her husband in his ministry. Chloe led the church's women's group, organized charity dinners, oversaw the children's Sunday school, and was the life and soul of all social events. Her home was always open to guests, whether they were young families in need of support or elderly parishioners who needed companionship. Neighbors often said that Chloe had a way with everyone, and her homemade baked goods became legendary in the neighborhood. The Muller family home on Maple Street was a 2-story white colonial-style building with blue shutters and a well-kept garden. Chloe personally tended to the rose bushes in front of the house, and in the spring, their home became one of the most beautiful in town. Inside, it was cozy and tidy. Antique furniture, family photos on the mantelpiece, bookshelves, and a piano on which Chloe sometimes played hymns. On Sundays, Grace Church gathered about 200 parishioners, almost a third of the town's population. Among the regular members of the community, Edmund Riley, the 42-year-old owner of Riley's Bakery, held a special place. A tall man with kind brown eyes and calloused baker's hands, he had inherited the family business from his father and turned the small bakery into a thriving enterprise that supplied bread and pastries to all of Havenford. Edmund was a widower. His wife Mary had died of cancer 3 years ago, leaving him alone in a large house on the outskirts of town. After his wife's death, he immersed himself even more deeply in church life, becoming a deacon and one of the most generous donors in the community. The bakery opened at 4 in the morning, and Edmund was often the first to arrive at church for morning prayers before opening his shop. A particularly warm relationship developed between the Miller family and Edmund. Klaus valued him as a reliable assistant in church affairs, and Chloe often ordered baked goods from him for church events. Edmund never charged the church the full price, considering it his contribution to the common cause. On holidays, he was often invited to the Millers for dinner, as everyone in town thought it was wrong for such a good man to be alone. In the summer of 2024, a significant event took place in the life of the community. The church council decided to undertake a major renovation of the building. After more than a century of existence, the church needed to update its heating system, repair the roof, and modernize the electrical wiring. A special fundraising committee was created, headed by Chloe, and Edmund became an active member. The renovation plans were discussed at weekly committee meetings held at the Mullers' home. Chloe prepared coffee and homemade cakes, and the participants gathered around the dining table, surrounded by blueprints and estimates. Edmund, who had practical experience in construction matters thanks to repairs in his bakery, became an indispensable consultant for the project. During these meetings, Klaus often stayed in his study, preparing sermons or studying the scriptures. He trusted his wife with organizational matters, knowing her abilities, and only occasionally popped into the living room to greet the gathering or express his gratitude for their diligence. Gradually, a special understanding began to form between Chloe and Edmund. They often stayed after the official end of the meetings, discussing the details of the project over a cup of tea. Edmund increasingly lingered, helping Chloe clear the dishes or telling stories from the life of a baker. Chloe, in turn, showed increasing interest in his work, sometimes visiting the bakery during working hours under the pretext of ordering baked goods for the church. By the fall of 2024, an attentive observer could see that the Müllers' marriage was going through a rough patch. Klaus was becoming more and more immersed in his work, spending long hours in his office or visiting parishioners. His sermons became more intense, with topics increasingly focusing on spiritual struggle, temptation, and the need for constant vigilance against sin. Chloe, on the other hand, seemed to be blossoming. She began to pay more attention to her appearance, smiled more often, and showed unusual activity in public affairs. Neighbors noted that she began to leave the house more often, citing church business, and sometimes returned later than usual. Edmund had also changed. Previously withdrawn and focused on his work, he had become more sociable, appeared more often at church events, and even began to participate in the choir. His bakery was thriving, and he was planning an expansion, which required frequent consultations with Chloe on obtaining permits and financing through church connections. October rain drummed on the roof of Riley's bakery, creating a cozy atmosphere inside the warm room filled with the aroma of freshly baked bread. Chloe Müller stood by the display case, pretending to choose pastries for the church tea party, but in reality, watching Edmund as he kneaded dough for tomorrow's baking. "Mrs. Müller, you've been staring at those eclairs for 10 minutes. Edmund smiled, wiping his floury hands on his apron. "Is something wrong?" Chloe laughed, feeling slightly embarrassed. "Sorry, Edmund. I was thinking about the numbers. How many people usually come to our Thursday meetings?" "No more than 15, he replied, moving closer to the display case. "But to be honest, Mrs. Müller, you look preoccupied. Is everything okay?" Chloe paused for a moment, looking at his face. There was genuine concern in Edmund's eyes, something she sorely missed at home. "Yes, of course. It's just that there's so much to do with this renovation. Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in plans and estimates." "I understand," Edmund nodded. "Isn't Pastor Müller helping?" "I've noticed he hasn't been coming to our meetings much lately." "Klaus is very busy," Chloe said slowly. "He's preparing a series of sermons on spiritual warfare. He says the congregation needs a serious spiritual awakening." Edmund frowned. "Spiritual warfare? That sounds pretty intense." "Yes, all his sermons have been like that lately," Chloe sighed. "He used to talk more about God's love and forgiveness. Now it's all about sin, temptation, and how easy it is to fall." "Maybe he needs a break," Edmund suggested. "Pastoral ministry is a heavy burden." Chloe looked out the window, where raindrops created intricate patterns. "I feel like he's distancing himself from everyone, even from me. We hardly talk except about church matters." "I'm sorry to hear that," Edmund said sincerely. "You deserve more attention." A pause filled with unspoken tension hung between them. Chloe felt her pulse quicken. "I'll take a dozen eclairs," she said quickly, "and thank you for your understanding." 2 weeks later, Chloe sat in her living room, laying out renovation documents on the coffee table. Edmund arrived at the committee meeting first, as he had been doing lately. "Where is everyone?" he asked, taking off his wet jacket. "Mrs. Parker is ill, and Mr. Thompson is stuck at work," Chloe explained. "I'm afraid it's just the two of us today." "Not the worst turn of events," Edmund smiled, sitting down in the chair opposite her. We'll be able to focus on the details. Chloe poured coffee from a thermos. Klaus is late again at church. He said he's studying Greek texts for a new sermon. What's it about this time? Edmund asked, taking a cup. The whore of Babylon. Chloe couldn't hide the bitterness in her voice. He said that the modern world is full of spiritual whores who seduce believers. Edmund grimaced. That's a pretty dark topic for a Sunday sermon. All his sermons have become like that. Chloe put down her cup, her hands trembling slightly. Sometimes I feel like he sees sin everywhere. Even in me, in you? Edmund was surprised. Chloe, you are the most devoted pastor's wife I know. What could he possibly find sinful in what you do? Using her name without the formal Mrs. Muller sounded intimate, and they both felt it. I don't know, she replied quietly. Maybe that I spend too much time away from home, or that I enjoy the company of other people. Chloe, Edmund leaned forward, you have a right to companionship, to joy. Marriage should not be a prison. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something intangible but important happened between them. Chloe felt warmth spreading through her chest and realized she was on dangerous ground. We should get back to the plans, she whispered, looking down at the documents. Of course, Edmund agreed, but he didn't take his eyes off her face. In November, the relationship between Chloe and Edmund quietly crossed a new boundary. It happened during their trip to Lexington to pick up building materials for the church. Klaus was supposed to go with them, but at the last minute, he declined, citing the need to prepare for an important sermon. I don't understand why he can't put off those sermons for at least a day, Chloe said as they drove down the highway in Edmund's truck. Perhaps work has become a way for him to avoid other things, Edmund ventured cautiously. What other things? Intimacy. Real relationships. Sometimes people hide behind their work when they're afraid to face reality. Chloe looked at him. Did you do that? After Mary died? Edmund gripped the steering wheel tighter. Yes. For the first 2 years, I practically lived at the bakery. I thought work would help me forget the pain. But it only delays the inevitable. What helped? Time, and the realization that Mary wouldn't want me to bury myself alive. He glanced at her quickly. And good friends. They spent several hours at the hardware store, selecting materials and consulting with experts. Chloe was impressed by Edmund's knowledge and how respectfully the salespeople treated him. For the first time in a long time, she felt like part of a team, not just a pastor's wife fulfilling her duties. Over lunch in a small cafe, their conversation became more personal. Tell me honestly, Chloe asked, have you ever thought about remarrying? Edmund thought for a moment, slowly stirring his coffee. Not before. It seemed like a betrayal of Mary's memory. But lately, he looked up at Chloe. I'm beginning to realize that loneliness is not the way to honor someone's memory. What changed? I met someone who reminded me how wonderful simple human connection can be. He paused. Someone who made me feel alive again. Chloe knew he was talking about her, and her heart beat faster. Edmund, I'm sorry. He shook his head. I shouldn't have... No. She reached out and touched his hand. I'm glad you said that. Because I feel something special too. Their fingers intertwined on the table, and they sat like that for several minutes without saying a word. Meanwhile, noticeable changes were taking place in the church. Klaus's sermons were becoming increasingly passionate and gloomy. On a Sunday in mid-November, he delivered a particularly memorable sermon. Brothers and sisters, his voice boomed through the church. We are living in the days of the great apostasy. Satan walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour, and he begins with those closest to the throne of grace. The congregation exchanged anxious glances. Usually calm and measured, Klaus seemed agitated, almost feverish. The enemy uses the sweetest temptation, he continued. He disguises sin as friendship, understanding, sympathy. He whispers, "You deserve more. You are underappreciated. No one understands you." Chloe, sitting in the front row, felt the blood drain from her face. Could he know? "But I tell you," Klaus raised his hand, "blessed is he who withstands temptation, for when he has been tested, he will receive the crown of life." After the service, Edmund approached Chloe at the church entrance. "Quite an intense sermon," he said quietly. "Yes," she tried to remain calm. "Klaus has been very concerned about the spiritual state of the community lately." "Chloe," Edmund looked around cautiously, making sure no one could hear them. "I wanted to talk to you about what's going on between us." "Edmund, this isn't the place." "Then where? When? We can't just ignore how we feel." Chloe hesitated. She knew she was standing on the edge of a precipice, but the pull was too strong. "Tomorrow," she whispered. "Come at 2:00. Klaus will be at Mr. Davis's hospital." The next day, Edmund arrived at the Muller's house with a bouquet of autumn flowers. "This isn't very wise," Chloe said, letting him into the house. "Maybe," he said, handing her the flowers, "but I couldn't come empty-handed." They sat in the living room trying to maintain the appearance of normal conversation, but the tension between them was palpable. "Chloe," Edmund finally said, "I have to be honest with you. What I feel is more than friendship." "I know," she replied quietly, "and I feel the same way. But we can't." "Why? Because you're married to a man who barely notices you exist?" "Edmund, this is wrong. I am the pastor's wife. I have obligations to the community, to God. What about your obligations to yourself?" He moved closer to her. "Chloe, when was the last time you were truly happy?" She couldn't answer because she couldn't remember. "Mary said something to me before she died," Edmund continued. "She said, 'Don't bury your heart with me. Find someone who will make you alive again.'" Tears welled up in Chloe's eyes. "What if it's a sin?" "Sin is the destruction of something beautiful," he said, gently taking her hand. "What we have between us is beautiful. It can't be a sin." When he leaned down to kiss her, Chloe didn't pull away. December brought early winter to Havenford. Snow covered the streets in a thick white blanket, and Grace Church looked especially majestic against the backdrop of snow-covered fir trees. But beneath this idyllic picture lay dangerous passions and growing tension. Chloe Muller stood at her bedroom window, watching Klaus clear the path to the house. Her husband worked methodically, almost mechanically, as if physical labor helped him cope with his inner turmoil. In recent weeks, she had noticed that he had become even more withdrawn, spending most of his time in his study studying ancient texts. "Klaus," she called from the window, "why don't you take a break? I've made some hot chocolate." He looked up, and Chloe noticed with concern the dark circles under his eyes. "Thank you, dear, but I have to finish. And then I need to get back to preparing my sermon." "About spiritual warfare again?" "About Judgment Day." His voice sounded strained. "About how the Lord will separate the sheep from the goats." Chloe felt a familiar pang of guilt. Over the past month, her meetings with Edmund had become regular. Officially, they continued to work on the renovation project, but their relationship had long since gone beyond business. Stolen kisses, long embraces, declarations of love. All of this had taken place in secret while Klaus was busy with his ministry. The ringing of the phone interrupted her thoughts. "Hello?" "Chloe, it's Edmund." The familiar voice made her heart beat faster. "I got the final quotes from the contractors. Maybe we could meet today to discuss everything." She glanced around, making sure Klaus couldn't hear the conversation. "I don't know, Edmund." "Klaus is home, and Chloe," his voice softened. "I miss you. We haven't seen each other in 3 days." "I know," she whispered. "I miss you too, but it's getting harder." "Then let's meet at the bakery after closing, at 7 in the evening. Klaus usually spends Mondays at church, right?" "Yes," she hesitated. Okay, but not for long. That evening, Chloe told Klaus she was going to visit Mrs. Parker, who was ill, and headed for Edmund's bakery. The snow crunched under her feet, and the streetlights cast cozy circles of light in the winter darkness. She felt guilty, but at the same time she was looking forward to the meeting. Edmund was waiting for her in the back room of the bakery, where he usually did his accounting. A single lamp burned on the table, creating an intimate atmosphere. "You came?" He stood up and hugged her. "I was afraid you'd change your mind." "I almost did," Chloe admitted, not pulling away from his embrace. "Edmund, we're playing with fire." "I know," he said, gently touching her cheek. "But I can't stop. You've changed my life, Chloe. After Mary died, I thought I'd never be able to love again. And I thought I had forgotten what it was like to be desired," she confessed. "Klaus looks at me as if I were part of the church property." Useful, but not particularly important, Edmund held her closer. "You are the most important thing in my life. Chloe, I want you to know that what we have isn't just a fling. I'm serious about this." "What do you mean?" "I want us to be together, for real. I know that means divorce, scandal, but—" "Edmund, stop!" She pulled away from him. "You don't understand. I'm the pastor's wife in a small town. If I leave Klaus, I'll be banished from here, and his career will be ruined. What about your happiness? Sometimes happiness is a luxury we can't afford." He took her hands. "Chloe, look at me. Can you really live your whole life in a loveless marriage, pretending to be a happy pastor's wife while dying of loneliness inside?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "I don't know. I just know that I love you, and that scares me." "It scares me too," he kissed her. "But sometimes you have to take a risk to get something worthwhile." They kissed long and passionately, forgetting everything else. When Chloe finally looked at her watch, it was almost 9. "Oh my God, I have to go." She grabbed her coat. "Klaus will be worried." "Chloe, wait." Edmund stopped her at the door. "Next Friday, my sister is coming from Louisville. She's staying at the Maple Inn. We could spend time there. Real time, not these brief encounters." Chloe knew what he was suggesting, crossing the final line. "Edmund, think about it." He kissed her gently on the forehead. "I'll wait." When Chloe returned home, Klaus was sitting in the living room with a Bible on his lap. The lamp next to the armchair cast dramatic shadows on his face. "How is Mrs. Parker?" he asked without looking up. "Better," Chloe lied, taking off her coat. "The doctor said she'll be fine in a few days." "Good." Klaus turned the page. "Chloe, I wanted to talk to you about something." Her heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "Your work with the Reconstruction Committee. I've noticed you've been spending a lot of time with Mr. Riley. We're working on an important project, Klaus. It requires coordination." "Of course." He finally looked at her, and there was something disturbing in his eyes. "Just remember, dear, that a pastor's wife must be above suspicion. People watch us and judge us more harshly than others. What are you trying to say?" "I'm not trying to say anything." He closed the Bible. "Just reminding you of the importance of caution. Satan tempts those who are close to serving the Lord especially hard." Chloe felt the blood drain from her face. Did he suspect something? "Klaus, if you have specific concerns—" "I have only one concern." He stood up and walked over to her. "That my wife remembers her responsibilities to God and the community." He kissed her on the cheek, a cold, formal kiss, and headed for the stairs. "I'm going to bed early. Tomorrow will be a long day at church." On Friday morning, Klaus left the house earlier than usual, saying he was going to Lexington for a meeting with the bishop. Chloe walked him to his car, trying to look normal. "When will you be back?" "Late tonight, maybe even tomorrow morning if the meeting runs late," he said, getting behind the wheel. "Chloe, take care of yourself. And remember what I said about being careful." After he left, Chloe spent agonizing hours deciding whether to go to her meeting with Edmund. She knew it would be a point of no return, but loneliness and the need for intimacy proved stronger than reason. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, she knocked on the door of room 205 at the Maple Inn Hotel. Edmund opened the door and a joyful smile spread across his face. "You came." "Yes," she said quietly as she entered the room, "but I'm very afraid." "We won't do anything you don't want to do." He hugged her. "Let's just be together." They sat on the edge of the bed, holding hands and talking about the future, about their dreams, about what their life together might look like. Edmund was gentle and patient, not forcing her into anything. "Chloe," he said, looking into her eyes, "I want you to know that no matter what happens, these moments with you are the most beautiful in my life." When they finally kissed, Chloe felt all her doubts melt away. At that moment, only the two of them existed. Klaus Müller sat in his car in the parking lot of the Maple Inn, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wasn't going to see any bishop. Instead, he was following his wife, driven by the growing suspicions that had been tormenting him for the past few weeks. At first, it was small things. A new dress bought for no particular reason, frequent church business that required her to be away, a strange distraction during conversations. Then he noticed how she looked at Edmund Riley during church services, how she lingered near him after committee meetings. Last night, he checked her phone and found deleted messages. It wasn't difficult to recover them for someone who had studied computer technology in seminary. The messages weren't overtly romantic, but the tone, frequency, and timing all pointed to a closeness that went beyond a business relationship. And now, he had proof of his worst fears. "Whore," he whispered, staring at the windows of room 205. "Whore of Babylon." His hands trembled as he opened the glove compartment and took out a small notebook. It contained all his suspicions, all his observations over the past few weeks. Now, he had proof. But instead of rage or the desire to burst into the room and cause a scene, Klaus felt a strange calm. It was as if the fog had lifted and he could finally see the truth. This wasn't just his wife's betrayal. It was a sign, a divine revelation. If his own wife, the pastor's wife, a woman who was supposed to be an example of Christian virtue, had fallen so low, what about the rest of the congregation? If sin had struck his own home, then the whole community was infected. "Lord," he whispered, closing his eyes, "I understand. You are showing me the truth, just as you showed Noah that the world was mired in sin and needed purification." Images from the Old Testament floated into his mind. Sodom and Gomorrah, destroyed by fire from heaven. The flood that washed sinful humanity from the face of the earth. Prophets calling for repentance, and when they were not listened to, calling for divine retribution. Klaus opened his eyes and looked at Grace Church, which could be seen from the hotel. His church, his flock, his responsibility. "If your right hand tempts you, cut it off," he quoted from the Gospel. "It is better for you to enter life crippled than to go with two hands into hell, into the unquenchable fire." In the evening, when Chloe returned home, Klaus greeted her with his usual smile. "How was your day, dear?" "Quiet," she replied, trying not to meet his gaze. "I read and cleaned the house." "Good," he hugged her, and Chloe felt his body tense. "I had a very productive day with the bishop. We discussed important issues concerning the spiritual state of our community." That night, Klaus did not sleep. He sat in his study, surrounded by open books of the Old Testament, writing plans in his notebook. The book of Ezekiel lay open at the page describing divine judgment. "And the Lord said to him, 'Go through the city, through Jerusalem, and mark a sign on the foreheads of the people who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed in it. But to those who hear my voice say, follow him through the city and strike them.'" But his plans did not include marks on the foreheads of the righteous. There were no righteous people in his vision at all. Sunday morning, December 15th, 2024, began unusually. Klaus Müller woke up at 5 in the morning with a crystal clarity in his head that he hadn't had in weeks. He got out of bed quietly so as not to wake Chloe and headed to his study. On the desk lay a can of gasoline, which he had bought the day before under the pretext of refueling the lawnmower, several heavy chains from the garage, and a set of locks purchased at a hardware store in a neighboring town. Next to them lay his notebook with the plan he had been thinking about all night. "Lord," he whispered, kneeling down, "give me the strength to do your will. As you cleansed the world with a flood, as you wiped Sodom and Gomorrah from the face of the earth, so let me cleanse this flock with fire." He opened the Bible to the book of Genesis. "And the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone, and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities, and all the region round about, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground." At 7 in the morning, Klaus quietly left the house carrying a gym bag. Chloe was still asleep, and he left her a note saying he was going to church to prepare for the service. It was true, though not the whole truth. Grace Church was quiet and empty. Klaus turned on the heat, as he did every Sunday morning, then walked to the side and rear exits. Working quickly and methodically, he wrapped chains around the door handles and secured them with heavy locks. He left the main entrance open. People had to come in. In the basement of the church, where the Sunday school and storage rooms were located, he placed cans of gasoline at strategic points near the heating system. The smell of fuel was strong, but the ventilation quickly dispelled it. "Pastor Müller?" The voice made him start. Klaus turned and saw Emily Foster, a young teacher who usually helped with the children's service. "Emily." He quickly closed one of the cans. "You're early." "I wanted to prepare materials for Sunday school." She looked curiously at the cans. "What's that?" "A problem with the heating," Klaus lied calmly. "I had to add a special fluid to the system. But everything's fine." "I see," Emily nodded. "Need any help?" "No, thanks. I'm almost done. See you upstairs." When Emily left, Klaus felt his pulse quicken. He hadn't planned on anyone seeing his preparations, but it was too late to back out now. By 9 o'clock, parishioners began arriving for the service. Chloe was one of the first to arrive, elegant in the dark blue dress Klaus had once given her for their wedding anniversary. She kissed him on the cheek. "You look tired, dear." "Didn't sleep well?" "On the contrary," Klaus smiled at her, his first genuine smile in many days. "Today is a special day, Chloe. I feel that the Lord has something important in store for us. What wonderful sermon awaits you?" She adjusted his tie. "About judgment," he replied simply. "About how sin does not go unpunished." Chloe sat in the front row, as usual. Edmund arrived shortly after, greeting her politely and formally before taking his usual seat in the third row on the right. There were no signs of particular intimacy between them. They had learned to be cautious in public. By 9:30, the church was almost full. The Parkers with their 3 children, elderly Mrs. Davis, who never missed a service, the young Thompsons with their newborn, local banker Mr. Hall, with his wife, Farmer Johnson, teacher Emily Foster, shop owner Mr. Green. The whole community had gathered, as it did every Sunday. Klaus stood behind the pulpit, watching the church fill up. 23 people. The church was almost full. He saw sin in every face, the greed of Mr. Hall, who charged excessive interest on loans, the vanity of Mrs. Thompson, who gossiped about her neighbors, the laziness of Johnson, who cheated on his taxes, and at the center of it all was his unfaithful wife and her lover. "Brothers and sisters," he began when the clock struck 10, "today we will talk about God's justice." The sermon began as usual. Klaus read from the book of Genesis about Sodom and Gomorrah, his voice calm and measured. The congregation listened attentively, although some noticed that the pastor looked paler than usual, and his hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages of the Bible. "Abraham begged the Lord to spare the cities," Klaus continued. and God agreed not to destroy them if there were at least 10 righteous people. But there were none. Chloe noticed a strange intensity in her husband's voice. Usually his sermons were calm and full of hope. Today there was something ominous about them. What does the Lord do with a city where there are no righteous people? Klaus raised his voice. Where every person is mired in sin, where even those who should be examples of holiness betray their sacred bonds. Edmund felt an unpleasant premonition. There was something personal, pointed in the pastor's words. And the Lord said, Klaus continued, his voice growing louder, the destruction of sinners is from the Lord. He slammed the Bible shut with such a bang that several parishioners flinched. But today, his eyes scanned the congregation, pausing on Chloe's face, then Edmund's. Today, the Lord will not seek the righteous among us, for he already knows they are not here. An uneasy silence fell. Mrs. Davis exchanged glances with her neighbor. Mr. Hall frowned. Emily Foster felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Klaus, Chloe called softly. What are you doing? But the pastor had already left the pulpit and was heading for the main entrance of the church. From under his robe, he took out a heavy chain and lock. Pastor Mueller? Mr. Hall asked anxiously. What's going on? Klaus didn't answer. He wrapped the chain around the door handles of the main entrance, his movements quick and decisive. Klaus! Chloe jumped up from her seat. What are you doing? What the Lord has commanded me to do, he said, locking the chain. I am cleansing his house of filth. Panic began to rise slowly, like a wave. Several people rose from their seats. Pastor, open the door, Edmund said firmly, walking toward him. Klaus turned around, and there was something terrifying in his eyes, a mixture of rage and religious ecstasy. Don't come near me, adulterer, he hissed. You have defiled my house, my wife, my church. Edmund stopped dead in his tracks. A cold terror washed over him. Klaus, Chloe slowly approached her husband. Please, let's talk. Open the door, and we'll discuss everything. Discuss? He laughed. The sound was painful and frightening. The time for talking is over, whore. The time for judgment has come. He took a lighter out of his pocket. My God, Mrs. Davis whispered. He's going to set the church on fire. Panic erupted instantly. People rushed to the side exits only to find them locked. Screams, children's cries, and the sound of people banging on the doors filled the sanctuary. Klaus, no! Chloe grabbed his arm. There are innocent people here. Children. There are no innocents. He pushed her away. We are all sinners in the hands of an angry God. Edmund and several men tried to grab the pastor, but Klaus quickly descended into the basement. The sounds of struggle and screams came from above, but he was focused on his mission. The first lighter ignited a gasoline-soaked rag near the heating system. The flames eagerly spread to the combustible material, and the basement was instantly engulfed in fire. Upstairs, Edmund and Thompson tried to break one of the side windows with a chair. The glass was thick and old, and it cracked, but did not break. Children! Mrs. Parker screamed, hugging the frightened little ones close to her. Save the children! Emily Foster, remembering the small window in the Sunday school room, ran to the back of the church. Smoke was already seeping in from below, and the heat was becoming palpable. In the basement, Klaus stood amid the raging flames, his face calm, almost peaceful. The fire was spreading quickly through the wooden beams of the old building. Lord, he prayed, accept this sacrifice. Let the fire cleanse what love could not cleanse. Emily managed to break a window in the utility room and get outside. She was the only one who made it out alive. The others were trapped in the main hall of the church where the smoke was getting thicker and the temperature was rising by the second. Chloe and Edmund instinctively reached for each other in those last moments. All pretense, all caution lost its meaning in the face of death. Forgive me, she whispered, hugging him. I have nothing to forgive you for." He held her tightly. "I love you." Mr. Hall and Johnson tried with all their might to break down the main door, but the chains were too strong. Young mother Mrs. Thompson lost consciousness from the smoke, her husband trying to protect their newborn baby. Elderly Mrs. Davis, who had lived in Havenford all her life and had seen this church built, sat in the front row praying the Lord's Prayer. Smoke enveloped her, but she continued to pray until her last breath. The Parker family huddled near the altar, the father shielding his wife and children with his own body, trying to protect them from the fire that had already begun to lick at the wooden pews. In the basement, Klaus stopped praying. Smoke filled his lungs, and he fell to his knees amid the fire he had started. His last thought was one of satisfaction. He had done God's will, cleansing the church of sin. Outside, the first residents of Havenford heard screams and saw smoke around 10:30 in the morning. By the time the fire brigade arrived from the neighboring town, Grace Church was a blazing inferno. Emily Foster stood at a safe distance, sobbing and explaining to the firefighters who had arrived that people were trapped inside. But it was too late. The fire had completely engulfed the building. It took 3 hours to extinguish the fire. When the smoke cleared, all that remained of Grace Church were charred walls and a pile of ashes. Firefighters found 23 bodies in the ruins. Among them were Chloe and Edmund, found in each other's arms near the altar. Klaus lay in the basement, surrounded by empty cans and the remains of incendiary devices. The Parker family died together. A young mother with her newborn baby, elderly Mrs. Davis Banker Hall, all those who came to pray that Sunday morning, unaware that their pastor considered them unworthy of life. The only survivor was Emily Foster, a 28-year-old teacher who will remember the screams of people trapped in the burning church for the rest of her life. By evening, news of the tragedy had spread throughout the state. Havenford, a quiet town where everyone knew everyone else, where doors were left unlocked, had become the site of one of the most horrific crimes in Kentucky history. In the Miller home, neighbors found Klaus's notebook with a detailed plan for cleansing the church and pages from his diary where he described his suspicions about his wife's infidelity and his conclusion about the general sinfulness of the community. Detective Margaret Crowe arrived in Havenford 4 hours after the tragedy. A 48-year-old woman with graying hair and piercing gray eyes, she headed the Kentucky State Police's Major Crimes Division. In her 20 years of service, she had seen a lot, but the scale of the Havenford tragedy shocked even her. The ruins of Grace Church were still smoldering when she arrived at the scene. Firefighters were extinguishing the last pockets of flame, and the county coroner had already begun working on the bodies. A crowd of locals had gathered at a safe distance, their faces expressing shock and disbelief. Detective Crowe? County Sheriff Bill Henderson, an elderly man with tired eyes, approached her. "My God, I'm glad you're here. In 30 years on the job, I've never seen anything like this. Tell me what we know." Margaret took out her notebook. 23 victims, including the pastor. The only survivor is Emily Foster, a local teacher. She's in the hospital with smoke inhalation, but she's conscious. Margaret glanced around at the charred ruins. What do the firefighters say? Definitely arson. Multiple points of ignition in the basement. And the strangest thing, the sheriff paused, all the exits were locked from the inside. With chains and locks. From the inside? Yes. Someone locked the people inside the church and then set the building on fire. Margaret felt the familiar cold touch that always accompanied particularly difficult cases. I need to talk to the survivor. In the hospital room, Emily Foster lay under an oxygen mask, her face pale and her eyes red from smoke and tears. When Margaret entered, the young woman tried to sit up. "Don't get up," the detective said softly, pulling a chair up to the bed. "I'm Detective Crowe. I know this is hard for you, but I need to know what happened." Emily took off the mask with trembling hands. "He's Pastor Muller. He's gone mad. Tell me everything from the beginning." Emily closed her eyes, gathering her courage. The service started as usual. But the sermon was strange. The pastor talked about Sodom and Gomorrah, about how there are no righteous people among us. And then, she trembled, he came down from the pulpit and locked the main entrance. What did he say? That he was cleansing God's house of filth. He called Mrs. Muller a whore and Mr. Riley an adulterer. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Chloe Muller and Edmund Riley? Yes. There was something between them. Everyone knew it, but no one talked about it openly. It's a small town, you know. How did you manage to escape? I ran to the Sunday school room. There was a small window there. The others were locked in the main hall. Tears ran down her cheeks. I heard their screams. The children were crying, and I couldn't do anything. Margaret handed her some tissues. Emily, have you noticed anything strange in the pastor's behavior lately? The young woman thought for a moment. This morning, when I came to church, he was in the basement with some cans. He said there were problems with the heating, but it smelled like gasoline. He was preparing in advance. It seems so. Detective, is it true that everyone died? Margaret nodded. 23 people, including the Parkers and their children. Emily burst into tears. Little Sarah and Tommy. They were only 7 and 9 years old. Returning to the scene, Margaret began a detailed examination. In the basement, among the charred remains, forensic experts found 5 empty gasoline cans and the remains of homemade incendiary devices. Klaus Müller's body lay in the center of the basement, surrounded by evidence of his crime. Detective, one of the technicians called her over to the staircase leading to the main hall. Look at this. The remains of chains and locks were clearly visible on the charred door frames. The 3 exits, the main, side, and rear, were all locked in the same way. He planned this carefully, Margaret said. No one was supposed to get out alive. Detective Crow? A young officer approached her. We searched the Miller's house. We found something interesting. The pastor's house on Maple Street looked peaceful and ordinary against the backdrop of the tragedy that had unfolded a few hours earlier. On Klaus's desk in his study lay open books of the Old Testament and a thick, leather-bound notebook. Margaret put on gloves and opened the notebook. The first entries were dated early November, November 2nd. Chloe was an hour and a half late from the church meeting. She said she was delayed at Riley's discussing project details, but the smell of his cologne on her clothes. November 15th, checked her phone, deleted messages, recovered some. The tone is too intimate for business correspondence. November 28th, followed her to the Maple Inn Hotel. Riley was waiting for her in room 205. Now I have proof. The entries became increasingly disjointed as December approached. December 1st. If my own wife has fallen so low, what about the rest? The Lord is showing me the truth through her fall. December 10th. Read about Noah. God did not spare the sinful world, and I must not spare the sinful community. Fire will purify what love could not purify. The last entry was made on the morning of December 15th. Today the Lord calls me to action. As Elijah called down fire from heaven on the prophets of Baal, so I will call down fire on this corrupt community. Let no one say that I did not warn of the coming judgment. Religious psychosis, Margaret said quietly, closing the notebook. He truly believed he was doing God's will. By evening, journalists from across the state had arrived in Havenford. The small town, which had not seen a single murder in the last 50 years, was suddenly the center of national attention. Margaret held a press conference outside City Hall. At this time, we can confirm that the fire at Grace Church was an act of mass murder, she began. Pastor Klaus Müller locked 23 people inside the church building and set it on fire, dying along with everyone else. What was the motive? One of the reporters shouted. Preliminary investigations indicate that Mr. Müller discovered his wife's infidelity and, suffering from religious psychosis, came to the conclusion that the entire community needed to be purified. Were there any warning signs? Margaret paused. Analysis of the suspect's personal records shows a gradual deterioration in his mental state over several weeks. Unfortunately, no one around him recognized the seriousness of the situation. 2 days later, Margaret visited Emily Foster again, who had already been discharged from the hospital. The teacher lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, and since the news of her survival became known, there had been a constant stream of journalists and curious onlookers. "How are you holding up?" the detective asked. "Not well," Emily replied honestly. "I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I hear their screams." They sat in the living room, where newspapers with headlines about the Havenford massacre and the killer pastor lay on the table. "Emily, I know about Mrs. Muller's affair. Tell me what you knew about it." The young woman sighed. Everyone sensed it, but no one spoke openly. Chloe and Edmund had a special closeness between them. They were alone together too often, looked at each other too long. In a small town, you can't hide things like that. And the pastor? Did he suspect anything? He changed in the last few weeks. He became gloomier, more withdrawn. His sermons became obsessive. He talked about sin and divine retribution all the time. Emily shook her head. But no one thought he was capable of such a thing. "Are you planning to stay in Havenford?" "I don't know. There's no church here anymore. Half of my students are dead. The town is dying along with those people." The funeral took place a week after the tragedy. Since the church had been destroyed, the service was held in the local school gym. Relatives of the victims came from all over the state, as did representatives of other churches. Margaret attended the ceremony, watching the grieving faces. 22 coffins stood in rows. Klaus Müller was buried separately in another cemetery. The funeral service for the Parker family was particularly tragic. 3 small coffins stood next to their parents' coffins. The children's grandmother, who had come from Louisville, wept so hard that she had to be supported by her arms. The pastor from the neighboring town who conducted the service spoke of forgiveness and divine mercy, but his words sounded hollow in light of what had happened. How could one speak of God's mercy in a hall filled with the coffins of innocent victims? "We are gathered here not to understand," he said, "but to remember our loved ones and entrust them to the Lord." After the ceremony, Margaret approached the mayor of Havenford, an old man who had run the town for 20 years. "Mr. Johnston, what will become of the town?" The mayor shook his head. "I don't know, detective. We've lost almost a third of our population. The church was the heart of our community. I'm not sure we can recover." A month after the tragedy, Margaret received the final results of the examinations. Klaus Müller's psychological profile, based on his notes and witness statements, painted a picture of a man suffering from acute religious psychosis, exacerbated by personal trauma. The subject exhibited classic signs of paranoid disorder with religious delusions, she read from the psychiatrist's conclusion. The discovery of his wife's infidelity was the trigger that led to a complete mental breakdown and the formation of a delusional system about the need for divine purification. Toxicological tests found no drugs or alcohol in the pastor's system. He was sober and, in his own opinion, perfectly sane when he committed the mass murder. The final element of the investigation was an examination of Klaus's computer. Technicians found search history in his browser. How to make an incendiary mixture, ways to block doors, the combustion temperature of gasoline. He had been planning the murder for at least 2 weeks. 22 people died because one man couldn't cope with his wife's infidelity and lost touch with reality. Among the victims were children who didn't understand what adultery was, elderly people who had lived honest lives, young families with plans for the future. They all died because the man they trusted with their souls decided he had the right to pass divine judgment. Leaving Havenford, Margaret took one last look in the rearview mirror at the deserted town. Some crimes can be investigated and solved, but some scars never heal. The case of the mass murder at Grace Church was officially closed, but its consequences would be felt for years to come. In the memories of the survivors, in the empty houses of Havenford, in the cautionary example of how religious fanaticism can become a deadly weapon. The only consolation was that such tragedies are rare, but when they do occur, they remind us how thin the line is between civilization and chaos, between faith and madness.